In a neglected corner of Wyoming, a young widow battled to keep her 2 children warm through a relentless, endless winter. Her seasonal job at the local grocery store barely managed to put food on their table, while an ignored foreclosure letter sat on the kitchen counter like a relentless countdown. That night, as the wind howled against the weathered wooden walls, she longed only for a peaceful evening. Then came the urgent barking, a flashing light, and a Navy SEAL collapsing into the snow, his canine partner trembling but protecting him with steadfast loyalty. She rushed to his side, never suspecting that this wounded stranger carried a truth powerful enough to shake her past and become the one hope to save their future. Before we start, tell us where you're watching from. And if this tale touches your heart, subscribe for more stories of courage, sacrifice, and unbreakable bonds. Your support means everything. A Wyoming winter night pressed down on the land like a vast sheet of glassy ice, swallowing light sound and hope in its bitter breath. Inside an aged wooden home perched on the edge of a barren field, Sarah Whitmore moved quietly through the kitchen. At 32, she bore the weary grace of one who had stood strong far longer than she should. Medium in height, her build was slim yet resilient from years of hard labor. Her dark blonde hair, usually loosely tied low on her neck, revealed faint streaks of silver under the lamplight. Early marks of stress, not age. Her skin was pale from the unforgiving cold, with faint shadows beneath soft blue eyes that once brimmed with dreams, now heavy with responsibility. She stirred a pot of soup, thinning more by the week. Her seasonal grocery job paid just enough to survive, but never enough to keep the foreclosure notices piling relentlessly in her inbox from creeping closer. She avoided glancing at the latest letter left unopened on the counter. Her late husband's name, Daniel Whitmore, still stamped at the top, though he'd been gone nearly a year now. The official report called it a highway accident. Sarah had memorized the words. The lies she had memorized even more deeply. Her 12-year-old son, Jacob, sat at the table helping his little sister with homework. He had inherited Sarah's pale eyes, but wore a weight far too heavy for a boy his age. His brown hair hung messy, and long haircuts were a luxury they simply couldn't afford. His shoulders were broadening, though his posture still revealed the boy hidden inside the emerging young man, earnest and fiercely protective, desperately trying to fill the void left by Daniel's absence. He rarely complained, perhaps sensing how fragile his mother truly was. His little sister Emily, just 8 years old, had long chestnut hair she refused to cut because her dad used to braid it. She was small and gentle for her age, easily scared but quick to offer a smile when comfort was near. Tonight, however, she spoke very little. The storm outside tore at the windows, and she clutched her worn, stuffed rabbit like a shield against the fury. The wind battered the house like furious fists. Jacob glanced up. "Mama, is the roof going to hold?" Sarah forced a smile. "It's stood up to worse, sweetheart." But in the quiet that followed, she silently wondered if her words were just a fragile lie. The storm grew fiercer. Snow hammered the walls with angry blows. The old house groaned beneath the assault, its wooden beams exhausted from years of neglect. Sarah stepped to the window and saw nothing but blinding white darkness and the distant faint glow of the town. Too far to reach in tonight's storm even with an emergency. "Let's get ready for bed," she whispered softly. But before she could clear the dishes, a piercing sound shattered the tempest outside. A sharp, desperate bark echoed from beyond the backyard fence. Not a neighbor's dog, not a coyote, something deeper, urgent. Emily froze. Jacob sprang up so fast his chair scraped violently across the floor. "Mama, you heard that too, right?" Sarah's heart pounded fiercely. She grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and hurried toward the back door. Just before she reached it, another bark louder. Pain cut through the wind. Jacob dashed to the window with Emily close behind. He shoved it open an inch. A frigid wind stabbed inside, sending curtains billowing wildly. Snowflakes spun into the room like jagged shards of glass. "I see something," Jacob shouted urgently. There's a light," Emily whispered breathlessly. "Someone's out there." A faint beam flickered through the blizzard, shaky weak, then blinked out altogether. The silhouette of a man staggered into view, then collapsed hard onto the snow. Sarah's stomach dropped. "Stay inside," she ordered. But Jacob was already pulling on his boots, his eyes filled with fear and adrenaline fighting together. Heart hammering, Sarah grabbed her coat. "Stay close to me. Emily, don't let go of my hand." They pushed the door open into the fury. The wind slammed against them, stealing their breath. Snow roared and swirled, blurring everything beyond a few steps. "There!" Jacob cried, pointing out. The beam of the fallen flashlight lay half-buried beneath the snow's cold embrace. Beside it, a massive German shepherd, its fur black and tan, stained by patches of dried blood, growled weakly, dragging an injured leg but fiercely guarding the man beneath. The dog's eyes were sharp, wary, trained no ordinary companion. Sarah dropped to her knees. The man lying in the snow was broad-shouldered, muscular, even beneath torn green camouflage. His jacket was shredded by a bullet's path, blood frozen stiff along the jagged edge, forming a dark, cruel crust. His face, rugged and angular, was pale with cold. Short, dark hair clung to his damp forehead. A faint stubble covered a jaw carved from stone. He looked around, 35, lethal and broken all at once, and he was still breathing. "Dear God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Jacob swallowed hard. "Mama, he's a soldier." "No," Sarah said, realization flooding her. "Not just a soldier, a Navy SEAL." The dog growled again, struggling to stand despite its injury. But when Sarah gingerly touched the man's shoulder, the dog lowered its head not in menace but desperate loyalty. "He needs help, now," Sarah declared. With Jacob pushing from one side and Sarah pulling the other, they hauled the unconscious SEAL across the snow toward the warmth of the house. Emily held the flashlight, her small hands trembling, the beam flickering with each breath. The storm roared outside as the world shrank down to darkness, howling wind, and the heavy weight of a stranger fighting for life. When the door slammed behind them, sealing out the storm, Sarah didn't yet know that by saving him, she had stepped straight into the path of the danger chasing him. She eased the stranger onto the old sofa, its cushions worn flat from years of use. The heat from the wood stove pushed against the biting cold, but barely enough to fight back the chill seeping beneath his skin. Snow still clung to the torn threads of his green camouflage jacket. With trembling hands, Sarah cut open the fabric and felt her breath hitch. There was far more blood than she ever expected. Up close, the man appeared sculpted by a harsher reality. His broad shoulders held tension muscles tight even in unconsciousness. Short, dark strands dampened his forehead, while a rugged stubble framed his powerful jawline. A subtle scar not born from violence, but from the trials of life, traced near his temple. Yet beneath that hardened exterior, his face bore a weariness she knew too well, the weight of a soul who had shouldered too many burdens alone. Jacob lingered by the sofa, gripping the flashlight's handle firmly. The boy fought to keep calm, but worry flickered behind his eyes. Emily nestled close against her mother's leg, trembling slightly, clutching her stuffed rabbit like a lifeline that breathed with her. Canine, unmistakably a seasoned German shepherd of 4 or 5 years, its amber eyes sharp despite the pain, rested at the sofa's base. The dog's fur bristled defensively whenever Sarah moved too swiftly, yet its loyalty to the injured man held it still. The animal observed her like a vigilant soldier sizing up a stranger, alert and unblinking. Sarah reached for the family's modest first aid kit, a far cry from a combat medic's arsenal, but it was all they had. Inside, rubbing alcohol bandages, scissors, and a cold pack from the freezer. "Jacob, steady the lantern," she whispered gently. The boy nodded and leaned closer. She peeled back the man's shirt. A bullet had grazed him across the ribs, shallow but long. Purple bruises spread along his side, signs of impact, a tumble, or both. Some injuries were fresh, others traced the quiet suffering of endurance. She pressed gauze to the bleeding wounds. He groaned, eyes fluttering beneath half-closed lids. "Easy," Sarah murmured, unsure if he could hear her. But he did. A broken, raspy voice fought its way out in fragments. "The drive. Don't let him—" Then silence. Sarah stiffened. She caught Jacob's questioning glance. What was he trying to say? Jacob whispered. "I don't know," she said quietly. "But he's in real danger, that much I know." Outside, the storm howled, shaking the walls. Sarah checked her phone signal. Nothing. No bars, not even emergency service. The wind had toppled the cell tower miles down the road last month, and the county still hadn't fixed it. Their landline had died years ago and was never replaced. Next, she searched through the stranger's gear. His radio was busted open, wires bare, the casing dented by a bullet. His GPS flickered once, then died. She found a device that could have been a locator beacon, but crushed its antenna bent inward like a broken bone. Whoever did this made sure he'd never be able to call for help. K9 let out a low growl. Sarah's heart jumped, but the growl wasn't aimed at her. It was for the wind rattling the door, the porch groaning under the snow's heavy weight. The dog listened to the storm like it was expecting someone to step out from the shadows. Emily crawled closer to the sofa. "Mama, is he going to die?" Sarah brushed her daughter's hair soft and warm beneath her chilly fingers. "Not if we can stop it," she whispered. "But who is he?" She didn't have an answer she could share. Instead, she focused on tending his wounds. His breath, though shallow, steadied slightly. She wrapped his ribs tight, pressed a heating pad to his side, then sighed deeply as she covered him with the thickest blanket they owned. As she finally stepped back, she noticed Jacob was intently watching the man. "He's not just any soldier," he murmured. Jacob spoke softly. Sarah turned to him. "What makes you so sure?" Jacob gestured toward the patch stitched onto the torn sleeve. The navy blue trident shimmered faintly in the flicker of the firelight. "That's a Navy SEAL badge. I saw it on a documentary at school." A knot tightened in Sarah's stomach. She'd heard about SEALs men who survived the impossible men who went where no one else dared. But if this man had ended up on her doorstep, bleeding and half-frozen, what kind of enemy had pushed him through a raging Wyoming blizzard? Thunder rumbled across the sky as the lights flickered and finally went out. Emily whimpered softly. Jacob grabbed a candle. K9 stood up, ears perked, body rigid with alertness. Sarah swallowed hard. "All right, the power's out. Stay calm." She felt panic rising in her throat, but forced it down. "We'll make it through this night," she promised the children, and maybe even herself. Returning to the stranger, she pressed her fingers to his wrist again. His pulse is stronger, though still faint. She brushed a loose strand of hair from his forehead. His skin burned with fever, but was cold from shock. A terrifying contradiction. "Mama," Jacob whispered. "What if whoever's after him finds us?" The question cut deep. She glanced between the storm ravaging the world outside and the man lying unconscious on her couch. The dog stood guard, a silent sentinel by his side. "We'll lock every door, board, up the windows if we have to. No one's getting in tonight." But even as she spoke, a chill settled deeper than the cold caught in her bones. Because the way K9's ears twitched, the way he kept glancing toward the door, the way he positioned himself protectively in the shadows told her this wasn't just some wounded soldier. He was someone hunted, and by dawn her peaceful life would shatter forever. Morning crept in without sunlight, a pale gray seeping through frost-covered windows. The storm had not let up. If anything, it had sharpened its teeth, howling against the timber walls, like a living beast clawing its way inside. Sarah moved quietly through the living room, adding more logs to the stove. Her fingers were stiff with cold, but warmth began to fill the room. The injured Navy SEAL still rested on the sofa, his breathing steadier and deeper than before. His fever had broken sometime just before dawn. Jacob and Emily sat nearby on the floor, munching cereal from mismatched bowls. K9 lay between them like a steadfast guardian, resting his head on his paws, but eyes always scanning the space. The shepherd was large, close to 70 pounds, with a thick black and tan coat. His left hind leg carried a slight limp from last night's wound, but his discipline was unwavering. Every noise outside made his ears twitch like high-powered radar dishes. When the man finally stirred, a sharp breath escaped him. His eyelids fluttered open, and Sarah caught a flash of confusion, instinct, and pain flickering behind his eyes. Then training snapped in like a curtain closing. His gaze sharpened, surveying the room with precise, practiced efficiency. "You're safe," Sarah said softly. "You're in my home. You collapsed outside last night and we brought you in." The seal blinked slowly, grounding himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was raspy and cracked from dehydration and the cold. "Son." "How long was I unconscious?" Sarah answered softly. "Most of the night. You're fortunate your dog never left your side." Kine let out a low, comforting growl, his tail thumping once against the ground. The man reached out, placing his hand gently on the dog's neck, his face softening just for a moment. In that quiet exchange, there was a shared understanding, affection, gratitude, the bond of survival. Then he turned his attention back to Sarah. His eyes were steel gray, sharp and clear, a man who had endured far too much. "I'm Mason," he said finally, his voice crisp and direct. "Lieutenant Mason Cole, a U.S. Navy SEAL." The name carried a heavy weight, a history Sarah could only imagine. Now seated upright, his features came into sharper focus, a strong jaw, high cheekbones, a nose slightly crooked from a long-past break. The kind of face forged by struggle and the harsh realities of battle, not comfort. Sarah introduced herself and the children, and Mason offered a single nod of respect, but his eyes already shifted to the pile of shattered gear on the table. His radio, GPS, and locator beacon all ruined beyond repair. "I need to see these," he murmured. Sarah handed over the devices. Mason turned them over carefully, his brow tightening with each inspection. Melting snow dripped onto his fingers. The internal circuits were charred, wiring snapped, antenna bent sharply. "These devices weren't casualties of the storm," he muttered. "They were deliberately sabotaged." Jacob swallowed hard. "By who?" Mason clenched his jaw, weighing how much to disclose. "People who want me dead." Silence descended, rapidly heavy and suffocating. Emily clung tighter to her stuffed rabbit. Sarah steadied her voice. "Should we contact the sheriff or someone from the county? They could send help?" The refusal came so quickly, it jolted her. Mason leaned forward, a flicker of pain crossing his ribs, but urgency pushed him through it. "If you make a call, any call your phone will connect to civilian towers. The instant that happens, they'll track your location." Sarah's stomach twisted. "That sounds impossible. How would they know which call it is?" "They're scanning for any new signal that suddenly appears in this valley." Mason rubbed his forehead as his headache deepened. "They're hunting for me. Even if your phone connects for just a moment, they'll triangulate your position." Jacob paled. "Why? Why are they after you?" For a long moment, Mason remained silent. His quiet filled the space like another brewing storm. Then he reached for a small, battered black device next to his gear, a rugged, military-grade flash drive wrapped in reinforced armor. "That's what they want," Mason said softly. Sarah stepped closer. "What's on it?" she asked. "Data lifted from their servers," Mason explained. "Encrypted files, financial trails, names, operations, and something else I haven't cracked yet." He rubbed the back of his neck muscles tense. "But the data's a trap. If I connect the drive to any civilian device, your phone or laptop, it will erase everything immediately. And if I use any unsecured network, they'll trace it within minutes." "So you can't call for help," Sarah said slowly. "I can," Mason corrected her. "Bun. But only when the storm hits its fiercest. When the winds howl with full force, I can send out a faint, scattered signal. It's weak enough for federal agencies to detect, but too weak for the criminals to track." He shifted with a sharp breath, pain flickering through clenched teeth. "When the storms rage hardest, I'm able to broadcast a fragile, scattered signal. It's faint enough to reach federal systems, yet too weak for those criminals to trace. He moved with agonizing effort, breathing out through gritted teeth. Until then, we wait in silence. The kids watched him with wide-eyed wonder, and slowly, almost reluctantly, Mason's tough exterior began to soften. His gaze shifted to Jacob. "How old are you, kid?" 12. "Ever tied a bowline knot?" Jacob shook his head no. Mason gave a single nod. "Come here. I'll teach you." Despite the raging storm and looming danger, that moment became an island of calm and learning. Mason demonstrated the rope's loops and twists, how to secure it tight. His hands were steady, voice patient, but unwavering. For a moment, he seemed less a hunted operative and more a guide someone made to mentor, not break. Emily hovered, close eyes filled with curiosity. Mason caught on. "Want to learn something too?" he asked gently. She nodded eagerly. He taught her the basics of self-defense, how to plant her feet, how to break a grip with leverage, not brute force. K9 nudged her elbow proudly. Later, as the kids quietly played with the dog, Mason pulled out the flash drive case, checking for damage. Sarah stood nearby, eyes tense with anxious hope. On the cracked military tablet, a list appeared. Damaged, barely alive, but just enough to pull diagnostics names, operators, shippers. Sarah's breath hitched at one name. Daniel Whitmore, marked as a staged accident. Her heart thundered in her chest. Her vision blurred at the edges. In a whisper, she said, "That's my husband." Mason looked up sharply, and in that frozen moment, the tempest outside paled in comparison to the storm raging inside her. The storm roared into a crescendo, shaking the wooden house to its core. Snow slammed against the siding like thrown stones, each gust rattling the worn boards of their shelter. Mason sat by the window, the dim lantern light carving sharp lines over his face. Though wounded, he'd regained enough strength to move with the cold precision of a trained predator. His breath steamed in the icy air, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the storm's rhythm, as if listening intently for something beneath the chaos. A whisper, a frequency, a fragile silence within the noise. K9 pressed close to his knee chest, rising and falling in calm control, ears twitching at every shift in the wind. The shepherd was stronger, now still limping slightly, but its posture sharp and ready. Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway, arms wrapped tightly around herself to brace the fear. Her dark blonde hair fell loose, strands brushing her cheeks every time a cold draft swept through the room. Exhaustion dwelled in her bright blue eyes, but beneath the fear was a hard, unyielding edge, a mother's resolve forged from a lifetime of survival. "Is this the moment?" she whispered softly. Mason nodded, adjusting the battered frequency device on the table. "The blizzard's at peak interference. If I send the signal now, it'll scatter harder for them to track. And with luck, the federal team will catch the digital signature." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "And if the enemy catches it first?" Mason didn't answer. He didn't need to. He flipped a switch. A faint tone, barely audible, pulsed to life, almost like a heartbeat. K9's ears perked. Mason tapped a coded sequence, every stroke deliberate, despite the stiffness in his fingers. "Signal sent." Sarah swallowed hard. "So now we wait." "No," Mason corrected firmly. "Now we prepare." The storm eased an hour later. Not gone, just softened enough to widen their view. Outside, the world transformed from a blank white canvas to a swirling gray haze of snow-draped pines and rolling drifts. As the wind dropped, Mason felt his stomach twist. "They're on their way," he whispered. K9 growled low and steady. Jacob, who had been stacking blankets to barricade the sofa, tensed up. "Is it the good guys, the feds?" Mason shook his head slowly. "No headlights, no engine sounds on the road. The pros wouldn't come with this storm raging, so who then?" A distant roar cut through, heavy and threatening, closing in fast. Mason's jaw clenched. Sarah moved to the window, pulling back a curtain. The instant she peeked outside, a gasp escaped her lips. A black pickup tore out of the snowy white mist, tires skidding sharply across the frozen ground. Its windows were pitch black. No signs, no hesitation. It didn't slow down. "Get away from the window," Mason snapped. Sarah ducked just as a bullet shattered the glass. The shot cracked through the house like thunder. Emily screamed. Jacob grabbed his sister, pulling her behind the sofa. K9 lunged towards the front door, teeth bared and growling fiercely. Mason yanked an old shotgun from behind the stove, a hunting gun that Daniel once owned. Its metal was worn and its wood scratched, but it was deadly. He loaded it with steady hands. "Back to the room now," he ordered urgently. He pushed the family into the small storage closet at the hallway's end, slamming spare boards against the doorframe for makeshift protection. Another bullet tore into the wall. Then glass rained down. The attackers weren't here to bargain bluff or sneak, they came to kill. 3 men advanced through the snow. Enough weak daylight slipped through the storm to make them out clearly. Thick jackets, tactical gloves, rifles gripped with cold precision. Faces obscured beneath scarves and hoods, their movements methodical and merciless. These were hunters, not rookies. The first opened fire again, aiming to shatter the remaining windows. The second circled toward the back door. The third knelt on the porch, pulling something from his jacket, a glass bottle with rags shoved inside. Heat flared in Sarah's throat. Oh God, a Molotov cocktail. Mason caught sight of it too. "Stay down." He swung the shotgun toward the window and fired. The blast roared through the house. The first attacker fell snow spraying around him. The second cursed ducking and firing wild shots at the house. Bullets hammered the siding splinters flying everywhere. The third lit the rag. Flames roared to life in his hand. K9 barked sharply in warning. Mason Sarah cried out, but too late. The bottle arced through the air, smashing into the porch. Flames erupted across the wood, licking upward with fierce, violent tongues of orange. Emily sobbed, burying her face into Jacob's chest. Jacob hugged her tightly, his own eyes wide with dread. Smoke crept beneath the bedroom door. Sarah's lungs burned with every breath. The room smelled of scorched varnish and melting snow. Mason reloaded, his breath uneven pain lancing through his side, but he forced himself to stand. He staggered back into the hallway, eyes stinging from smoke. "Cover your mouths. Stay low. Don't make a sound." Another blast rattled the front wall as a second fiery bottle exploded. Heat surged around them. Shadows flickered wildly. The roof groaned under the relentless pressure. Mason knelt beside Sarah and Jacob, his voice softer despite the chaos. "Listen to me. I'm sorry." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "For what?" he asked, his face tight with anguish. "For this, for dragging danger, knocking right at your doorstep, for pulling your family into a battle that's never been yours to fight. You don't deserve any of this. Not after everything you've already endured." Sarah looked at him, her eyes shimmering with fear, then hardening with a fierce resolve. She reached out her trembling hand, settling on his arm. "Mason, you didn't bring this storm to us. Life was brewing its chaos long before you showed up." Her voice wavered, but her eyes stayed steady. "You came because fate pushed you here. And maybe, just maybe this time, we don't have to face the darkness alone." Mason blinked, caught off guard by the fire in her tone. "If we must face the storm," she whispered, "then this time at least we stand together." The fragile moment hung between them, human, raw, and powerful, until K9's growl shattered the silence. A cold metallic click sounded at the front door. Mason's blood ran ice cold. "IED," he breathed. "They're rigging the entryway." Sarah held her children tight against her chest. The roof groaned under strain. Smoke thickened as the house trembled. Outside, the intruders shouted back and forth, boots crunching over frozen snow. Mason pressed himself into the corner shotgun, ready, though his hands shook with pain and fatigue. K9 leapt to his side, muscles tensed like coiled steel. Outnumbered, outgunned, trapped, and the IED at the door meant the clock was almost out. The chapter closes with Mason bracing himself against the wall. K9 snarling fiercely and Sarah clutching her children close as the attackers close in the house, trembling under the IED's final click. A faint metallic sound heavy with the threat of death. Smoke curled through the hallway like dark fingers seeking life. Mason pressed his back to the wall, shotgun-steady ribs burning with every breath. His rugged, stubbled, battered face showed the hard resolve of a man who'd survived worse, but never with so much on the line. Sarah crouched behind him, arms wrapped protectively around Jacob and Emily. Her dark blonde hair clung wet to her temples, her once wide eyes of fear now steeled with fierce determination. Motherhood had always forged her strength. Tonight it made her unbreakable. K9 stood firm beside Mason, hackles raised, teeth bared in a silent snarl. The shepherd's amber eyes blazed with loyalty pain and the sharp instincts of a soldier. Despite the injured leg barely touching the ground, the dog's stance was resolute, unwavering. The front door creaked open. Boots scraped the porch. A shadow flickered behind the broken glass. Then, with a violent kick, the last attacker burst inside. The explosion never came. Mason realized the device was set to collapse the entrance later, giving the attacker just enough time to get inside and trap them first. A tall man stepped through the threshold, draped in a heavy black coat dusted by snow. His face was half covered by a dark scarf. His cold, predatory eyes locked onto the family huddled in the corner. Clutching a rifle with steady hands, he moved like a killer who knew his trade well. Mason stepped forward, shielding his family with his body. Blood seeped through his bandages. His stance uneven, but voice ironclad. "Your fight's with me." The intruder's eyes flickered, recognition flashing. "Cole," he spat beneath the scarf. "Never thought you'd live long enough to see this door open." Before he could even raise his rifle, K9 surged forward with a fierce snarl, the shepherd's body crashing against the man's legs, sending him sprawling backward. The rifle went off the bullet, splintering into the ceiling. Sparks showered down around them. The assailant howled in rage, kicking wildly, desperate to break free. K9 clamped down on his arm teeth, biting through cloth and flesh alike. "Hold on!" Mason shouted. But a sudden movement at the window stole his attention. Another man was rising from the snow, gun raised and aimed inside. This one was shorter, but broad-shouldered, his thick beard and baseball cap shadowing cold gray eyes. His face twisted with raw fear and fury. He fired. The bullet shattered a lamp behind Mason, sending shards scattering through the room. Mason dove, rolled, and fired his shotgun once. The bearded man ducked just in time. The blast tore splinters from the window frame, while smoke, fiery light, and the raging storm intertwined in a chaotic dance. The first attacker freed himself from K9's grip, slamming the dog to the ground. K9 whimpered briefly, but rallied, rising again, ready to strike. "Stay back," Mason yelled, but K9 had already made its choice. The intruder raised his rifle once more. Sarah screamed. Emily buried her face into Jacob's chest. Mason pulled the trigger, only to hear the hollow click of an empty chamber. The sound rang louder than any gunshot. The intruder smirked behind his scarf and took careful aim at Mason's chest. Then a piercing sound shattered the night engines roaring nearby. Headlights cut through the blizzard with a blinding sweep of white and gold. Tires skidded against frozen earth. Doors slammed. Voices surged. A booming voice crackled through a loudspeaker. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." The attackers froze. Red and blue lights flickered wildly across the snowy yard, splashing the scene with urgent color. Shadowy figures in heavy tactical gear fanned out across the property. Rifles raised in deadly precision, the agents moved forward like an unstoppable tide, resolute and commanding. The bearded man cursed, scrambling toward the back door. An agent shouted, "Don't move," but he ignored the warning, and a single gunshot cracked the blizzard's howl. He collapsed into the snow, his weapon skidding away. The first attacker tried to flee, abandoning his rifle. K9 lunged again, tackling him into the porch railing, as two agents rushed in to apprehend him. The man struggled fiercely, spitting curses, bucking wildly, but three sets of hands pinned him down, cuffs snapping tight around his wrists. Mason staggered backward, leaning heavily against the wall. Relief flooded through him, mixed with deep exhaustion. The adrenaline crash hit him like a relentless wave. Then a female agent stepped inside, slender around 40, sharp features framed by dark eyes behind black-rimmed glasses. She wore a thick tactical parka, marked with DHS insignia. Her name tag read Agent Reyes. "Mason Cole?" she asked. He nodded weakly. "We only just caught your signal in time, lucky timing." She glanced toward the yard where agents secured weapons and gathered evidence carefully. "We've been tracking this crew for months. You handed us everything we needed tonight." Reyes lifted the small flash drive Mason had tossed her amid the chaos. She sealed it into a protective case. "This goes straight to the digital forensics lab, no detours." Sarah stepped forward, trembling. "Agent Reyes, does this mean?" Reyes softened her tone. "Ma'am, your husband's case. It was never an accident. I'm deeply sorry for everything you've been through, but tonight this man—" She gave Mason a nod. They just uncovered a chain of evidence strong enough to dismantle their entire operation. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, tears welling up as waves of sorrow, relief, and vindication crashed over her all at once. Jacob wrapped his arms around her waist tightly. Emily held onto her side quietly, weeping. Mason, wincing but determined, lowered himself onto one knee. He placed a gentle hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You kept your family safe. You did everything right." Jacob swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. "You came back for us, didn't you?" Mason asked Sarah. Through the tears, she met his gaze and offered a small, trembling, genuine smile. "I guess," Mason murmured softly. "I did." Weeks slowly slipped by. The house was rebuilt and fortified, thanks to federal aid and restitution funds seized from the criminal ring. The truth about Daniel's death was officially acknowledged, his name cleared at last. The family received compensation protection and much-needed closure. Mason returned to duty briefly, just long enough to heal, complete the mission, and make one life-changing decision. He chose Wyoming. He chose them. By spring, the snow softened into fertile soil, green shoots pushing through the ground. Kids from nearby towns came by on weekends to visit the new sanctuary Sarah and Mason built. Together, a peaceful refuge for veterans and retired service dogs. It was a place woven with warmth and purpose, where K9, his limp almost gone, chased after Jacob and Emily across the yard, barking happily beneath the spreading sunlight. Sarah stood on the porch, the wind gently lifting her hair. Mason leaned on the railing beside her, finally relaxed after all these years. The bruises were gone. The coldness in his eyes had melted away. He looked down at his family, then back up to Sarah. "The storm's passed," he'd said quietly. She slipped her hand into his. "For all of us," she whispered, and together they watched the dawn break over their fresh start. This story whispers a quietly powerful truth, that even in the darkest nights when storms rage and hope feels like a fading ember, help arrives in ways we never saw coming. Sometimes that help is the strength burning in our own hearts. Sometimes it comes through the hands of a stranger, and sometimes it's a brave soul walking through the snow, carrying the courage to change everything. Mason didn't stumble into Sarah's life by chance. He arrived like a small miracle, the kind that doesn't shout or boast, but arrives just when a weary soul needs to know they aren't forgotten. Maybe that's a truth for us all, that no matter how heavy our burdens, no matter what storms we quietly endure, moments of mercy are still written into our stories by a power greater than us. If this tale touched your heart, I invite you to pass it along to someone who might need a little light today. Share where you're watching from. Leave a comment below and subscribe for more stories of courage, faith, and the quiet miracles that surround us every single day. May blessings guard your home, bring peace to your heart, and remind you you matter, and you are deeply loved.